The gentle light of early morning filtered through the curtains in Thomas Bennett's room, casting soft shadows over the bedside table and a few scattered books. At 85, Thomas had lived through wars, traveled the world, and outlived most of his friends and family. He was a man of few words, his strength lying in his quiet resilience. But time had gradually caught up with him. The walls around him were silent, except for the quiet ticking of a clock and the deep, steady breathing of his most faithful companion, Rusty. Rusty, a golden-furred Labrador with a distinguished gray muzzle, had been at Thomas's side for the past 12 years. From the moment he had been brought home as a young pup, Rusty had shown a loyalty and gentle spirit that had made him Thomas's closest friend and confidant. They'd shared countless sunsets in the backyard, walks along the riverbank, and afternoons on the front porch, where Thomas would read out loud to him from novels or the occasional newspaper, as if Rusty understood every word. Thomas's daughter, Emily, had been there every step of the way too, from encouraging him to adopt Rusty to caring for them both when things started to get harder. She visited daily, helping her father manage his medication and keeping an eye on Rusty's health. She understood the bond between her father and Rusty, two souls who'd somehow found a quiet understanding in one another. This morning, however, felt different. Thomas's breaths were shallow, his skin pale under the morning light, and his eyes, usually so bright with life, seemed tired. His frail hands rested atop the soft blankets, his once strong fingers trembling slightly. Rusty lay curled up beside him on the bed, his head resting on Thomas's arm, gazing up at his aging master with warm, soulful eyes. Emily entered the room quietly, her face lined with worry as she took in the sight before her. She could sense that Thomas's time was nearing its end. She gently placed her hand on her father's shoulder, bringing him out of a half-sleep. "Dad," she whispered, her voice soft, and Thomas opened his eyes slowly and looked at her, his gaze filled with a calm acceptance. He offered her a faint smile and shifted his gaze to Rusty, who continued to lay beside him, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. Can you sit with me for a while?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Emily nodded, pulling a chair close to the bed and taking his hand in hers. She had been preparing for this moment for some time, but the reality of it weighed heavily on her heart. She wanted to make sure her father felt as comfortable and loved as possible in these final moments. Thomas's hand, still rough from years of work, gave her a light squeeze. He cleared his throat, casting a fond glance at Rusty. "You know, I always thought I'd be the one taking care of him, right until the end," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "But now it looks like he'll be the one watching over me." Rusty lifted his head slightly, his brown eyes fixed on Thomas, and gave a soft whimper, as if in response to Thomas's words. Emily's heart swelled, seeing the depth of their connection so clearly. "Rusty's been a good friend," Thomas continued, his voice trembling. "He's given me more than I could ever repay." He reached out and scratched behind Rusty's ear, causing the dog to lean into his touch, his eyes closing in contentment. "There's something about a dog's love, you know? It's pure. Doesn't matter who you are or what you've done. They're just there." Emily smiled through her tears, nodding. "I know, Dad. He loves you so much. We all do." Thomas nodded, closing his eyes for a moment as memories seemed to drift through his mind. He remembered the day he had first brought Rusty home. Emily had insisted it was time for him to have some companionship, but Thomas had been hesitant. After losing his wife, he wasn't sure he could handle the responsibility or the emotional attachment, but Rusty had a way of changing his heart. With each gentle nudge, every playful bark, and the warmth of his head resting on Thomas's lap, the dog had managed to bring life back into his quiet home. When Thomas opened his eyes again, they were wet with tears, though his expression was peaceful. "Emily," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "promise me. Promise me you'll take care of Rusty. He deserves a good life." Emily squeezed his hand, leaning closer. "I promise, Dad. I'll take care of him. He'll always have a home with me." At her words, Thomas exhaled, a look of relief passing over his face. He looked down at Rusty, who had moved closer, resting his head on Thomas's chest, his eyes full of loyalty and understanding. It was as if Rusty sensed that his role was shifting, that he'd need to be there for Emily now as well. "Rusty," Thomas's voice cracked as he addressed his beloved friend. "You've been my rock boy. Now you need to look after her for me. You understand?" Rusty let out a low whimper, his tail thumping softly against the bed, as if giving his word. Emily reached out to gently pat Rusty's back, feeling the weight of her father's request in her heart. The room was filled with an almost sacred silence, each of them seemingly aware of the significance of the moment. Then, Thomas's breathing became more labored, and he looked to his daughter one last time. "Em," he whispered, "thank you for everything. And tell Rusty, Tell him he was the best friend I ever had." Emily nodded, her own tears spilling freely. She leaned down, pressing her forehead against her father's, feeling his warmth for the last time. Rusty, too, seemed to sense the finality, and he nuzzled Thomas's hand gently, his quiet whine filling the room. Thomas's hand fell still on Rusty's head, and with one last gentle breath, he was gone. The room became eerily silent, save for the soft whimpers of Rusty, who nudged Thomas's hand with his nose, as if trying to wake him. Emily watched in stunned silence as Rusty, refusing to accept the loss, nudged her father's hand once more. His loyalty so strong, he let out a soft whine, placing his paw gently on Thomas's chest. The sight was more than she could bear, and a sob escaped her lips as she reached out to comfort the grieving dog. In that moment, Rusty lifted his gaze to meet Emily's. His eyes, usually so playful and full of life, were now filled with an unmistakable sadness, as if he understood exactly what had just happened. He climbed closer to Thomas, resting his head on his chest, his breathing slow and deliberate as he mourned quietly, accepting that his dearest friend was gone. The days following Thomas's passing were a blur for Emily. Between planning the funeral, sorting through his belongings, and handling endless paperwork, she barely had a moment to process her grief. Rusty, however, was a constant reminder of her father's absence. The loyal dog would wander through the house, his paws patting softly on the floors, looking into each room as if searching for Thomas, hoping he'd simply reappear. Each night, Rusty would curl up on the bed, his head resting on Thomas's pillow, letting out soft, mournful whines. Emily had taken to sitting beside him, running her hand over his golden fur as he stared off into the distance. She knew her father's passing weighed heavily on Rusty, just as it did on her, and she felt an unspoken bond with him now, a shared loss, a shared love. One evening, about a week after the funeral, Emily found herself sitting on the edge of her father's bed, staring at a photo of Thomas and Rusty. They were younger in the picture, Thomas with a warm smile, and Rusty looking as lively as ever. She felt tears well up as she remembered how the two of them had been inseparable. Rusty had been more than just a pet, he'd been family. As she sat there lost in thought, Rusty slowly approached her, his head hanging low. He nudged her hand gently, and she looked down at him, noticing the sadness in his eyes. Emily stroked his head softly. "I miss him too, Rusty," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know how we're going to do this, but we're in this together. I promised him I'd take care of you, and I mean it." Rusty let out a quiet sigh, leaning into her touch, and for a moment, it felt as if he understood every word she'd said. Emily wrapped her arms around him, holding him close, and they sat together in silence, each offering the other a comfort only they could understand. In the days that followed, Emily tried her best to keep to a routine for Rusty's sake. She took him on walks through the neighborhood each morning, stopping by the familiar places where he and her father used to go. At first, Rusty would look back toward the house, as if waiting for Thomas to join them, his ears perked and his tail still. But gradually, he began to adapt, accepting that these walks would now be with Emily instead. One afternoon, as they walked along the riverbank, Rusty stopped suddenly, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. Emily followed his gaze and saw an old worn bench nestled under a tree by the river, a spot where her father had often taken Rusty to watch the sunset. She hadn't been back to this spot since he'd passed, but standing there with Rusty, she felt a surge of bittersweet nostalgia. They walked over to the bench, and Emily sat down, letting Rusty climb up beside her. The two of them watched the water flow by, the gentle sound of the river bringing a sense of peace. Rusty rested his head on her lap, and she stroked his fur absent-mindedly, speaking softly to him. "I know it's not the same without him, boy," she murmured, "but I think he'd want us to keep coming here. It's like he's still with us in a way, watching over us." Rusty gazed up at her with those deep, soulful eyes, and Emily couldn't help but smile. Somehow, Rusty had become her anchor, a way of holding on to the love she and her father had shared. She found herself talking to him more often, sharing stories and memories of Thomas as they walked or sat by the river. Rusty would listen intently, his head tilted as if he understood every word, and it was in those quiet moments that Emily felt closest to her father. As weeks turned into months, Emily began to notice subtle changes in Rusty. His energy wasn't what it used to be, and he'd occasionally stumble on walks, his gait slower than before. She brushed it off initially, attributing it to his age, but deep down, she knew that Rusty was starting to struggle. The loss of Thomas seemed to have taken a toll on him, and it worried her to see the once vibrant dog looking so worn and tired. One rainy evening, as Emily sat with a cup of tea by the window, watching the droplets race down the glass, Rusty climbed up beside her and settled his head on her lap. She scratched behind his ears, feeling the slight tremble in his body. "We're going to the vet tomorrow, Rusty," she said softly, trying to keep her tone reassuring. Just a quick checkup, okay? I want to make sure you're doing all right." The next morning, Emily bundled Rusty into the car and drove to the veterinarian, her heart heavy with worry. Dr. Hart, the veterinarian who had treated Rusty since he was a pup, greeted them with a warm smile, but her expression grew more serious as she examined him. After a thorough checkup, Dr. Hart pulled Emily aside. "Rusty's age is catching up with him," she said gently, her eyes full of understanding. "I can tell he's been through a lot emotionally, especially after losing Thomas. It's common for pets to feel grief just as we do. His heart and joints are starting to show signs of strain. I'll give you some medication to help ease his pain, but you should be prepared. He may not have a lot of time left." Emily's heart sank at the words. She had known this day would come eventually, but hearing it felt like a fresh wound, a reminder that soon she might have to say goodbye to the last piece of her father. Dr. Hart placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "He's lucky to have you, Emily, and as hard as this is, being there for him now is the best thing you can do. Pets feel our love, especially at the end." On the drive home, Emily tried to hold back her tears, but Rusty, as if sensing her sadness, nudged her hand, his gaze filled with the same loyalty and love he'd always shown. She pulled over on a quiet street, turning to him with a trembling smile. "You've been so strong, Rusty," she whispered, scratching his chin. "Dad trusted me to look after you, and I'm going to be here with you every step of the way, just like you were for him." Over the next few weeks, Emily devoted herself to making Rusty's days as comfortable and joyful as possible. She brought his favorite blanket down to the living room, allowing him to rest there by the fireplace, where he could watch her go about her day. She cooked special meals for him, giving him treats of roasted chicken and bits of bacon, foods he adored. And every evening, they'd sit together on the front porch, where Emily would talk to him about her father and all the things she remembered. Rusty seemed to perk up during these moments, his eyes lighting up with recognition whenever she mentioned Thomas. Sometimes, he'd lift his head and look toward the yard, as if hoping that Thomas might walk up the path. Other times, he'd lay his head on her knee, his body relaxing as he listened to her voice, a quiet comfort they shared. One night, as they sat in the quiet of the living room, Rusty slowly climbed onto her lap, curling his aging body close to her. Emily wrapped her arms around him, feeling the warmth of his fur, and whispered, "Thank you, Rusty, for everything. You've been the best friend Dad and I could have asked for." Rusty's tail thumped softly, his eyes meeting hers with a gentle understanding, as if to say he was grateful too. He nestled his head into her chest, letting out a contented sigh. Emily held him close, her heart heavy but full of gratitude, knowing that Rusty had given her father, and now her, a love that was rare and irreplaceable. That night, for the first time in a while, Emily felt a small sense of peace. She knew her father would be proud, that he'd be grateful for the bond she shared with Rusty, and that somehow he was still with them, watching over them both. As the winter days grew shorter, Emily began to cherish every moment with Rusty. His health continued to decline, and though she tried to stay strong, each passing day felt like a countdown. She reminded herself that Rusty had given everything he could to her father and was now giving the same loyalty to her, a legacy of love and devotion that would forever bind them. One evening, Emily received a call from a neighbor who had known Thomas and Rusty for years. "I just wanted to say," the neighbor said softly, "seeing you and Rusty together brings back memories of your father. He'd be proud, Emily. I can see it in Rusty's eyes. He's loved and cared for. That's all Thomas wanted." After hanging up, Emily felt a strange mix of comfort and sadness. She could see the truth of her neighbor's words each time she looked at Rusty's soulful eyes. In them, she saw her father's wishes, his love, and the bond that had carried both of them through their darkest times. That night, as Rusty lay curled up beside her, Emily made a silent promise to honor her father's memory by carrying on with the love he had shown to others, especially Rusty. The following week, it became clear that Rusty's time was nearing an end. His movements grew slower, and he'd spend more time resting, his head often lying on Emily's lap, his once bright eyes now shadowed with fatigue. Emily held him close, speaking to him in gentle tones, and on those quiet nights, she felt her father's presence near them, as if he were somehow watching over them both. Then, one particular evening, Emily noticed a change in Rusty. He was restless, shifting uncomfortably as he lay by her side. His breathing was slower than usual, each breath coming with a soft shudder. Gently, she lifted him into her arms, carrying him to the front porch, where they'd spent so many evenings together, hoping the familiar setting would bring him comfort. She settled onto the porch swing, cradling Rusty close to her heart. The winter air was crisp, but still, the stars overhead casting a faint glow over the quiet street. Rusty looked up at her, his eyes filled with a quiet acceptance, as though he knew this would be their last evening together. Emily felt a tear slide down her cheek as she looked into his eyes, the sadness overwhelming but softened by the gratitude she felt for all he had given them. "You've been so strong, Rusty," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I promised Dad I'd take care of you, but I think you've taken care of me more than I ever could for you." Rusty let out a gentle whimper, resting his head on her shoulder. They stayed like that, in silence, her fingers softly stroking his fur as his breaths grew slower and more labored. She could feel his heart beating faintly, each pulse a reminder of the life he had shared with her and her father. With every breath, she felt her father's presence with them, as if he too was saying goodbye. As dawn began to break, the first light filtering through the trees, Rusty stirred one last time. He lifted his head slightly, giving Emily one final look, his eyes filled with a quiet, unwavering loyalty that seemed to say, "Thank you for being with me." And then, with one last breath, he closed his eyes and slipped away, his spirit finally at rest. Emily held him close, her heart breaking as she whispered her final goodbye. She knew she had kept her promise to her father. She had been there for Rusty as he had always been there for them. She stayed on the porch, holding him until the morning light filled the street, wrapping both of them in a peaceful glow. The next few days were filled with emptiness, and the house seemed unusually quiet without Rusty's gentle presence. She missed the way he'd lay by her side in the evenings, his comforting warmth a reminder of her father's love. Yet, amidst the sorrow, she felt an enduring sense of peace, knowing that she had honored her father's wishes and had been there for Rusty until the end. One morning, as she sorted through her father's belongings, she found an old, well-worn notebook tucked into a drawer. Opening it, she realized it was a journal her father had kept, documenting his life with Rusty, their walks, their favorite spots, the funny moments, and the quiet afternoons on the porch. Each entry was filled with affection, capturing their unique bond in simple, heartfelt words. In one of the final entries, written just a few weeks before Thomas had passed, she found a note he had left for her. "Emily, if you're reading this, it means Rusty and I have had a good life together. He's been my greatest friend and my truest companion, and I hope he'll be the same for you. Remember, love is what ties us together, even after we're gone. Take care of him and let him take care of you. I'm proud of you, Em. Love, Dad." The words brought fresh tears to her eyes, and she hugged the notebook to her chest, feeling her father's presence there with her. She realized then that Rusty had not only been a connection to her father, but he had shown her how love could transcend time, space, and even death. Rusty had become a reminder that she would never truly be alone, that her father's love would always live on through the memories they'd shared. In honor of that love, Emily began volunteering at a local animal shelter. She would walk the dogs, sit with them, and share stories about her father and Rusty. In time, she helped other families find their own connections, guiding people toward pets that would become their loyal companions. Just as Rusty had been for her father and herself, she felt a sense of purpose and healing in sharing her story, her heart gradually mending with every wagging tail and hopeful gaze. A year after Rusty's passing, on the anniversary of her father's death, Emily returned to the riverbank where they used to walk. She sat on the old bench under the tree, clutching her father's notebook and looking out over the water. She closed her eyes, imagining Rusty beside her, and for a moment, she felt a warmth spread through her heart, as if he were there, watching over her once again. As she opened her eyes, a golden retriever ambled over from a nearby family, its tail wagging as it approached her. The dog looked up at her, and Emily felt an odd sense of comfort as she reached out to pet him. She knew it wasn't Rusty, but in that moment, she felt his spirit there, reminding her that he would always be a part of her life, even in the smallest, most unexpected moments. Emily left the riverbank that day with a renewed sense of peace, knowing that love, her father's love, Rusty's love, was something she would carry with her forever. And as she walked home, she smiled, knowing that in the eyes of every dog she met, in the gentle quiet of her father's favorite places, she'd find traces of their memories, guiding her with the strength and love they had given her. For the rest of her days, Emily honored her father and Rusty by living a life filled with compassion, finding solace in the simple truth they had taught her, that love endures, bridging the gaps between past and present, guiding us home when we need it most.